Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Abbey, Adult Services Librarian for the City of Forest Grove, and I'm really happy to have you joining us tonight, both on Facebook and YouTube, for our second Black History Month presentation featuring Donna Sinclair, who's going to be talking about Black Woman in Green, Gloria Brown, and the Unmarked Trail to Forest Service Leadership, which was published in 2020 by Oregon State University Press. As always, these programs are interactive, so if you're watching us on Facebook and you have a question, please just pop it in the chat function. If you're watching on YouTube, you do need to have a YouTube account in order to participate. But otherwise, you're welcome to ask questions, make comments at any time during the program. We'll have some time at the end also to go through some of those questions as well. I'd like to remind you that this video and videos of all of our programs are archived on the library's YouTube channel. So if you happen to miss part of it, or you know somebody who can't be here tonight to watch it, just let them know. Go over to YouTube, search Forest Grove City Library. You'll see a link for playlists, and then when you open that, it's under live stream playlists, and it has all of our programs that have been archived since we've been doing this way back in August of 2020. And then you'll also see programs that are scheduled to happen as well. So if you see something there you like, and I know there's one up there right now that we've got planned for April, you can set a notification, you can subscribe. We definitely want you to keep on top of what we're producing and hosting on YouTube. So again, head on over to YouTube, Forest Grove City Library playlists, and you can find it from there. And we'd love to have you join us and share this with folks who can't be here. Our guest tonight, Dr. Donna Sinclair, is a history professor with Washington State University, Vancouver, and Western Oregon University. She's an author and a former Washougal, Washington school board member from 2017 to 2021. She's also a public history professional. She's written for the National Park Service, curated exhibitions, ran the Oregon Historical Society Oral History Program, and has managed major oral history projects throughout the Northwest. She teaches U.S. environmental, public, and gender history, and her research focuses on the incorporation of non-traditional employees into the U.S. Forest Service in the Civil Rights era. And a little disclosure, Donna and I have known each other for a long time. We used to work together at the Oregon Historical Society, and we were catching up just before we went live. So it's nice to reconnect after all these years. So I'm going to bring Donna into the stream. Good evening, Donna. Welcome.
Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just really excited to be here and to reconnect with you. And those were the days.
They were. They were good days, and it's great to reconnect with a former colleague. I was telling Donna that I came across this book. I was in Powell's, and I frequently browse the local history section in Powell's for program ideas. And I went around the corner, and there it was, and I saw it, and I saw Donna's name, and I was, oh my gosh. So sometimes that's how program ideas happen. So this was a result of going and shopping at Powell's. So yay, Powell's.
Yay, Powell's. That's right.
So Donna, I'm going to bring your presentation on screen, and then I'm going to step out. And then when you're done, I'll come back in. We can chat a little bit. And as always, if you've got questions, if you're watching, please pop them in there, and we'll get to them at the end. So here you go. And I will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Bob. Okay, well, I do hope that people will have questions. I have a fairly, it's a fairly long presentation, but I'll also be doing some reading from the book and telling you about Gloria and kind of putting it in context. And I wanted to start by letting you all know that I met Gloria Brown through her voice in 2004 as I listened to a recorded interview from one of my students. Gloria was then in charge of the Siuslaw National Forest, and she was the first Black woman in the country's history to be at that level in the U.S. Forest Service. So here's a map of the Forest Service, an agency that manages 193 million acres of forests and grasslands in the United States, so about the size of Texas. There's 155 national forests, 20 grasslands, and Region 6, which is where we are, includes Oregon and Washington and 17 national forests. 6 are in Washington, 11 are in Oregon. There's a national scenic area, a national grassland, and 2 national volcanic monuments. So Mount St. Helens and Newberry on the Deschutes-Ochoco National Forest. So the thing I wanted to share with you here that has to do with Gloria's story is that the agency has a sort of decentralized structure. So that means there are multiple levels, and this becomes important to Gloria's story. There's
Donna,
yes.
Donna, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt. We're not seeing all of your slides. We're just seeing the first slide.
Oh, uh-oh. That's not good. I forwarded, not fast forwarded, but I
There we go.
forwarded. Oh, you can see them now. Okay, so I guess
Yes.
I have to do it this way. This is okay. All right.
Sorry about that.
I advanced. We're having a little trouble with the slideshow with the way that this is working, but okay, that's fine. Thanks, Bob. Um, so the thing that I was explaining is that there are multiple levels in terms of the operations of the forest. And lots of you, I'm sure, are familiar with district rangers, right? Districts, the Forest Service districts. There is the supervisor's office for the forest supervisor. And then there's a regional office that would manage like Region 6 here, as you can see. And then there's the Washington office, which is where the Forest Service chief actually is. So here's the mission and motto. And when you take a look at this, you can see that this is what the agency looked like well into the 1980s. And Gloria went to work for the U.S. Forest Service in 1974 as a dictation transcriber in the national office in Washington, D.C. When she started her career in the Forest Service, 20% of the workforce was female, and very few women or African Americans were actually in professional positions. So there were some female scientists who worked in education or information and education. Today, fewer than 4% of agency employees are African American, and half of them are female. So a very, very small number of African American employees in the agency, even now. Now, the white male hierarchical Forest Service is the one that I knew and had studied for many years before I met Gloria. So you can see here that the mission historically, from Gifford Pinchot, is to provide the greatest good for the greatest amount of people in the long run. Today, the mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. And then the mission and accomplishment to do this really also includes achieving and supporting an effective workforce that reflects the full range of diversity of American people. That's actually the notion of representative bureaucracy, the idea that in a democracy, that representation at the bureaucratic or administrative level would actually represent the people. So what I did know about the Forest Service before 2004, which is what you see here, this slide is a course that I taught. What I know came primarily from archival research as I wrote a history of the relationship between the U.S. Forest Service and the communities of Stevenson and Carson in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that project led me to partner with Rick McClure of the Forest Service to develop a capstone class at Portland State University in which my students interviewed former Forest Service workers over a course of 3 years from the 1920s to the 1960s. So that was a course that I taught from 2000 to 2003. And we interviewed people who were engaged in doing things like stringing telephone wire, working in the woods for the Civilian Conservation Corps. These were engineers who built thousands of miles of road in the woods to get the cutout. And that project resulted in a book of oral histories called No Gold Bricking Here, Oral Histories of the Columbia National Forest, 1933 to 1942. And I'll actually put a link in the chat box if I can do that after we're done. But at the time when I was teaching that class, I was interested in women in the Forest Service. So I had contacted Jerry Williams, who was the Forest Service historian at the time. And he sent me an article that he had written in draft form that was about Forest Service wives. And so they were kind of additions to the Forest Service employees. They often worked on ranger districts without pay. There were some early women working on the National Forest who did fire watch. particularly in World War I and World War II. And that really was about it. So that's the Forest Service that I knew when David Gross, who's pictured here, I don't know if you can see me using my cursor, but he's the older gentleman here with the younger person. He approached Portland State on behalf of the Workforce Diversity Council and asked about developing an oral history project. He said there was an aging population in the Forest Service, people who were about ready to retire, who had joined the agency in the 1970s. There'd been a lot of people hired in that time period, in part because there were new kinds of activities that people had to do in the Forest Service. So this is what they called the era of the ologists. There were biologists and archaeologists and geologists and all sorts of people who joined in order to do some of the kinds of work that had become important. So we started doing some interviews, and it was kind of random. We had some people who were what they call line officers, so people who were in leadership, some people who worked in the field, and then some people who worked in civil rights. And I was immediately captured by the stories that I heard. There was a Hispanic man who lived in the San Fernando Valley in a family of 11 that picked cotton for a living. And he recalled looking at the faraway mountains and wanting to go there. From the San Fernando Valley. And he was excited when he heard about a program called the Youth Conservation Corps. Many of you may have heard of that, the YCC, and he found out that people could actually work in the mountains. He applied for the program and recalled waiting to find out if he could go. And one day he went to the mailbox and he found 2 letters from the YCC. This is one of my favorite stories. The first letter he opened said that he was not accepted. And then the other one said to show up next week. And so he threw the first letter away and he showed up the following week. And he later became a wildlife biologist with the Forest Service through the Student Career Employment Program. So this was a time when there were a number of programs for recruitment in order to bring people of color and women into the agency for the first time. So then there was an African-American soil scientist who had desegregated the Forest Service in Mississippi in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. That's a great story too. And another man who was a soil scientist who recalled coming out of Jim Crow, Louisiana, and helping older folks to vote when the Voting Rights Act was passed. So people's stories, of course, are connected to their personhood as well, not just the work that they did. Another story that captured my attention was the woman with multiple sclerosis who went out in the woods in a wheelchair to identify accessibility issues. So the agency had really had started to diversify. And the people who were interviewed at this time were talking about things like becoming public servants. And they were talking about the importance of representation, that a workforce reflective of the nation's diversity would better meet the needs of the American population through the connections that people would make. So here's a picture of me with Gloria at the beach. So then there was Gloria. Now, I remember that I cried the first time I heard her story as she spoke very calmly about how she got to the Siuslaw National Forest and became a forest supervisor in the first place. So Gloria was a city girl from Washington, D.C., who had planned to become a television journalist. At age 30, she became a widow with 3 children and an uncertain future instead. So I had heard her voice and I knew her story. But Gloria didn't meet me until 2013 when a friend of mine put the 2 of us together. Now, by then, my students' interviews had actually prompted me to focus on my dissertation on incorporating women and people of color into the Forest Service with the issue of representative bureaucracy, which I mentioned earlier, the idea that the workforce should be reflective of American diversity in the bureaucratic realm. That was at the core of my research. And so I went to interview Gloria, and 2 interviews and several discussions later, Gloria had identified me as the right person to help write her story. I kept telling her, you should write a book. You should write a book. She has such an amazing story. And so it was like going out on a date. She asked me one day if I would help her, and I'd been hoping she would do that. So I was thrilled and I said yes immediately. Neither of us knew then that it would take until 2020 to complete the book. So the outcome is a book that is born of a combination of those interviews, hours of conversation as we traveled together and interviewed other people, and the written word that was revised collaboratively and then read aloud. We read every word of it aloud over FaceTime and poured over various words to make sure that they were just right. Gloria lived in Lake Oswego. I live in Washougal, Washington, and we both faced a lot of challenges during the time that we were writing the book. I think we got the contract in 2015 and it came out in 2020, which I, as a scholar, considered relatively quickly. Gloria was on a deadline and she wanted it done quickly. So some of those challenges are included in the book, some aren't. Today, I'm going to tell you a few stories, read a few excerpts, in the hope that you will actually feel the richness of Gloria's story. And again, I hope you'll follow up with some questions. So now, before I tell you more about Gloria's story, I want to provide a little background on women and people of color in the Forest Service. So, but I'm going to start by reading a selection. Okay, so this is from the very beginning of the book. And this is how Gloria wanted it to start. Religious people say that when God closes one door, he opens another. People say that if something doesn't kill you, it will make you stronger. I believe both of these statements, maybe because my parents took me to church from the time I was born, to the Little Buds choir, the junior choir, and to more sermons than I care to remember. To this day, my extended family still attends the quaint red-bricked Russell Temple Methodist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, on South Alfred Street, with its 12 white steps and 12 windows tinted with heavenly symbols open to the sky. I used to daydream about my books, my life, and what I would be when I grew up, while the pastor preached in the stuffy, crowded house of worship. It was only when Willie James died that I stopped going to church and stopped daydreaming. It was September 1981. Willie James was a cement foreman for HHS Construction Company, and they were putting up a Marriott hotel 2 blocks from the White House. They took the bus together to work. That fated morning, she said, I went straight to my desk where I cheerfully answered, "Hello, Forest Service Information and Publications. This is Gloria Brown. May I help you?" People called to ask for all kinds of things: the brochure, whether Smokey the Bear could visit a school, and whether they could ski in the Mount Hood National Forest or go whitewater rafting in a national forest. It was 1981, and my office was on the 3rd floor, the same level as the chief of the Forest Service, the engineer Max Peterson. My first job with USFS was as a GS4 dictating machine transcriber, a DMT. I had passed the civil service exam and could have worked in any of several agencies: Forest Service, Department of Housing and Urban Development, or the Civil Service Commission. I picked Forest Service because my cousin worked for the Department of Agriculture, which manages the Forest Service. I never meant for it to be a career. It was just a job, a way for us to support our family. I wasn't ever planning to stay. It was just a good government job that paid well and that I needed while attending night school to become a reporter. That was my real goal. It was very obvious to me in those early days that only men reached the management level at Forest Service. You would see them in a room or around a table, and they were all white. They were all white men, and I knew they were making decisions about how to manage people and places I had never seen. So the title of that chapter is A Good White Collar Job. So this is a brochure from the Washington office. It's actually dated in July 1942, and that's where Gloria worked. And this is actually the sort of work that she did, the kind of clerical work. She often organized show me trips or family meetings. She answered the phone, basically was a receptionist. And you can see here that the clerical staff was chartered and created in the chief's office in July 1942. You can look here a little bit lower and see that the women who are there kind of in cocktail dresses, so they dress very nicely. And one of the reasons I like this particular brochure is in part because it shows the racial diversity, but it also shows the kind of work that the Forest Service does: research and administration and timber. And so you can see that in this recruitment brochure. So this is a 1967 recruitment brochure. And this one, the agency was trying to recruit more women in the 60s, but their occupational options were really limited at the time. So in 1963, the Equal Pay Act passed, but women remained in low-paid jobs. In 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Title VI actually barred discrimination in any federally assisted activity, and Title VII barred employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But that still didn't make a lot of difference in the Forest Service in the 1960s. So note that in 1966, fewer than 4% of all women then employed by the agency ranked above GS7. So this is the general service schedule that goes up to GS15, which, by the way, Gloria retired at a GS15, which was not easy to get to. So in 1966, again, very few women were above GS6, and only 14 women worked in the professional series. Most of them were in the research branch of the agency. But in 1967, the Civil Service Commission was charged with enforcing Executive Order 11375 that prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex and placed women under the federal Equal Employment Opportunity Program for the first time. Women were not included in that in the early years. It also created the Federal Women's Program. And again, impacts to the Forest Service were pretty minimal, but more women started to come into the workforce. These women generally did not hold leadership positions, and the number of women in the agency remained pretty limited into the early 1970s. So, but still, you can see here, the Forest Service started recruiting for a professional female workforce, and these images indicate that. Note here that the women have short hair. They're wearing blocky ranger jackets, so they're not in cocktail dresses anymore. And the brochure even included a professional Black woman in a hard hat. But still, the women shown full figure are wearing skirts, and they're leading a group of school children on a nature walk, which was sort of historically the position for women in the agency. Now, here we get to 1972, when things really start to change with the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, and that amended Title VII and gave the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission authority to enforce any litigation. So related to the Civil Rights Act. So discrimination was actually, there was some implementation of anti-discrimination law. And so finally, federal agencies and large private organizations actually had to hire women in non-traditional careers. So as foresters, for example, and you see again that reflected in this brochure. That was important to women for a lot of reasons, especially because of the benefits that were associated with working for the federal government. So that's something that's noted at the end of the brochure, which says that there were tangible outcomes for women who worked for the agency, like sick pay and annual leave, low-cost health and life insurance, a good retirement plan, job security, and regular salary increases that were based on performance and longevity. So these are good, secure federal jobs, right? By the early 1970s, the Forest Service offered training opportunities so that employees could develop, and this is in quotes, develop their talents to the maximum extent with equal consideration for promotion and placement. And in fact, the brochure noted that a lot of women started their careers as clerk typists or secretaries, and then they got agency training or self-development and were able to progress to more responsible, specialized positions. So there was internal training. And in most ways, the advancement promises of this Women in the Forest Service brochure kind of portended an era to come rather than the reality of the early 1970s, because occupational inequalities really persisted well into the late 20th century. So getting women to actually work for the Forest Service was a lot less difficult than placing them into positions that provided lucrative pay. Much less any degree of power or leadership. And it took a series of increasingly stringent mandates that were aimed at increasing the presence and status of women to effect a significant degree of change. It also took a court order in California that actually mandated the occupational equality in the area. So in 1976, though, the Forest Service established a civil rights policy. And at that point, Gloria had been with them for 2 years. So you can see here, you can see the impact of the civil rights legislation by looking here. This is 1964, 76, and 80. It's really reflected in the numbers here. So the green is minority professionals, the orange is women professionals, the yellow is minorities, and the pink is actually women at large. So from a few hundred women to over 10,000 women, the agency had hired between 1964 and 1980. So that's a lot. And that's major cultural change, of course, within the agency itself. Women became 28% of the workforce by 1980, and minorities were at 9.7%. In 1964, 5%, the minorities were at 5%. So you can see there the number of 860. And 139 were African American. Most of them were Spanish speaking. That's actually still the case, by the way. Professional minorities were in 1976 were at 2.7%. So some of those folks were foresters, and that's part of what I documented in my own work. And 4.7% in 1980. Professional women, again, very, very small numbers of professional women. So 1976, it's 1.7%, and 1980, it's 7.8%. So this is the context in which Gloria developed her career. So here she is when she graduated with a journalism degree from the University of Maryland. And this was not long after her husband was killed by a drunk driver as they left the college campus. At the time, she was a GS3 in the Forest Service. And when this happened, she lost not only her husband, but also his income. They had to pull their 3 children, or she had to pull the 3 children out of private Catholic school and move to what she considered a bad neighborhood in Maryland. And that was her main motivation for deciding that she had to move up in the agency. And she said to me once, I had to feed those kids. And that actual line is in the book at one point. But that's really what was happening for her. And so she decided to start strategizing. She knew she needed a mentor. And with some guidance, she also realized that if she wanted to be in management, she would have to leave Washington, D.C. Now, she thought she was going to end up in Atlanta. She thought she would end up in Region 8, where there's a pretty large African-American population. So here's Gloria in the Pacific Northwest, and I just love this picture of her. And so she explains what happened. She explains why and how she ended up coming to the Northwest. She said, I needed to understand how a region works in the field, as they say. So that's on the National Forest. So Tom and John, those were her mentors, facilitated a 2-week detail to the information office in Region 6 in Oregon on the other side of the country. This was my first plane ride ever, and it exposed me to an entirely new world. As the plane circled to land at the Portland International Airport, I was struck by the brilliant white-topped peaks of Mount Hood. I had seen the Smoky Mountains, but never anything like this. I also quickly realized that Oregon's population was as white as the mountain's peaks. I had worked with Caucasians for a long time, but never before had I seen a place with no African Americans. Yes, I learned there were a few in the state, about 37,000 in a population of 2.5 million. But they were not very visible in the Portland regional office or in the city's downtown area, and especially not on the Forest Service districts I visited. The most diversity I saw in Portland was in the personnel office, the mailroom, and the civil rights office. When I visited the Willamette National Forest, I saw no people of color. There were women, but at the forest and district levels, no one looked like me. What I did see everywhere I looked was the Northwest green, the color of money in the Forest Service, and the hue of deliverance for me. Jumping forward, she says, when I saw the massive trees, bigger than any living thing I had ever seen, soaring hundreds of feet into the air, a million fragrant needles sending oxygen into the atmosphere, I felt that I was in a cathedral, a church more powerful than any other. The Douglas firs, true firs, and pines towered over me. Brilliant shades of green and gold moss and lichen brought the forest to life, while the flaming red of Indian fireweed burned into my consciousness, and the solitude of the trails calmed my soul. There were no cars, no streetlights, and very few people, just trees, rivers, and wildlife. I had never known solitude like that before, even in a park. At a cookout in D.C., there were people everywhere. This was different. People walked the trails, but the forest enclosed you in solitude. I had sent out pamphlets about forest ecology, but had never walked in the forest. I had provided schools with educational materials about the environment, but had never seen old growth. For me, visiting the Willamette Forest was like going into a dark room and having the light come on slowly to reveal a new world. I had so many firsts. My parents didn't believe my stories. I decided then to one day work on the Willamette. Daddy did say that if I ever got to live in Oregon, he would love to visit and fish for some salmon. I eventually got to Oregon, but Dad died before he could catch that fish. So Gloria would have a lot more field experiences, and ultimately she got a transfer as a public affairs officer in the regional office in Missoula, Montana, which was a state with a fewer than 1% African-American population. And Gloria and her 3 kids moved to Missoula, and she worked in public affairs. Gloria learned a lot in those years. And so I'm going to read another section to you that's pretty, it's another one of my favorite sections. And I'm not going to stand here and read the whole time, but I did want to share some of the powerful imagery and powerful language that she uses as she recalls her story. So what she says is, I found myself surrounded by people who had worked half their lives in the woods, who shared stories about hunting and fishing, activities I had never done. The talk around the fire educated me. I had all the questions. Where did these huckleberries come from? Do we have to worry about bears or mountain lions? What about snakes? I found out there were black bears, but no dangerous snakes. I also learned to identify scat. I had never seen a cow patty, much less grizzly poop. The former is round, crusted over, and flat. The latter resembles dog poo, but bigger. I learned that huckleberries grow abundantly among the redwoods and Douglas fir. Native people had been picking the berries each summer for thousands of years. Non-natives had turned harvesting into an enterprise that included wine, candy, and jellies. Now, the little purple berry was at the heart of one of many multiple-use conflicts on national forests. I had never ridden a horse before, had never even touched a pony. Yet here I was learning to mount, ride, and steer a live animal. At first, I was too excited to be afraid. As we clomped down narrow trails over canyons, our guide told me not to worry. Then I realized that if my horse fell over, I would surely die. I'd never thought about dying at work before, but as I looked down from the back of a 5-foot-high animal into a ravine 10 feet below a trail already hundreds of feet high, it suddenly felt possible. I stopped looking down. This was one experience of many that made me say to myself, I can do this. Gloria would have a lot more field experiences, and ultimately she got a transfer as a public affairs officer in the regional office in Missoula, Montana. So, oh, I'm sorry, I already told you that part. So she learned a lot in those years, and by then, she had decided that nothing would stop her. So when her family experienced what she called the worst case scenario, which was racism directly impacting her children, she requested a transfer to the Portland regional office where they could be more comfortable. And things were better there. So that's when she really developed a strategy for moving up. And she knew that she learned by being out in the regional office and on the forest that she needed to get forestry credentials in order to be promoted. So she applied for a job on the Willamette National Forest, and she made a deal with the forest supervisor that if she could get his plan published, because it was long past due, he would give her a sabbatical to attend Oregon State University's School of Forestry. And that's an experience that's described in the chapter, Awakening the Forester Within. Now, Gloria hated dendrology, but she made it through OSU with good grades and a plan. She returned to the Willamette, and she moved from an administrative professional to a management 460 forester. So she was moving herself out of the office in public affairs, where she did the kind of what we'd think of for someone with a communications degree, into forestry. It was a shift that we compared in the book as moving from being a non-commissioned officer to being a commissioned officer in the military. So she was really on her way to becoming a district ranger. So, but after being told that a temporary position would not be made permanent, Gloria decided to take another avenue in order to advance. And this is one that I found was very common for African-American employees who were trying to advance in the agency. She left the Forest Service and went to work for the Bureau of Land Management instead. She became district director of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center. So this is a picture of Gloria and her son, Andre, doing living history. And Andre moved over to Eastern Oregon and went to college over there at Eastern. Gloria put her natural resource chops that she had developed and her people skills, which is really what carried her through, into action in Baker City. And that's where she earned awards from the Cattlemen's and Miners Associations. And then when her mother became ill, she got a transfer back to Washington, D.C., where she was put in charge of the Eastern States Land and Realty Program. This is for the Bureau of Land Management. But it didn't take her very long to discover that she now hated the city. So she made a call and returned to the Forest Service, this time as the first Black woman to manage the Mount St. Helens National Monument on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. She said, "I had missed the beautiful green forests, the diverse landscapes, mountains and waterfalls, mild breezes and soft rain, and the hordes of stars when I looked up in the sky. I may not have been born there, but I now considered myself a certified Westerner. I knew then that I would never live anywhere else." So Gloria was thrilled to return to the Northwest, where her daughters and her son had settled, and she reconnected with her life partner, Phil Weichland. So here she is pictured with then Forest Service Chief Mike Dombeck. So 2 years later, in 1999, actually it says that in the excerpt I'm going to read to you, Gloria became the forest supervisor on the Siuslaw National Forest. And she says, "I was heading back to Corvallis, only this time I had truly arrived. I was the first female African-American forest supervisor in the nation. I was proud of my tenure at Mount St. Helens, and this new appointment felt like the reward for a job well done. This would be a test of my survival as a leader and of the Siuslaw National Forest and its employees. It was also a test for women of color. There were a few, very few other Black women reaching for high-level positions in the Forest Service. Melody Mobley, a forester, had held a staff position in the Washington office, but left the agency a few years earlier. Leslie Weldon, a wildlife biologist, also had a staff position in D.C. Now it was 1999, and I was the first Black woman to manage an entire national forest, ever. Weldon, who later became deputy chief for the National Forest System, she later became associate chief, followed me the next year as the second African-American female forest supervisor. She was on the Deschutes National Forest. Leslie later said she stood on my shoulders to get there. So from there, Gloria went on to become forest supervisor at the Los Padres National Forest in California, which was a very different landscape that was beset by fire, as I'm sure you all are aware of. By then, her years of experience had given her a confidence that I really think comes through in the book's penultimate chapter, Can You See Me Now? And I think that's how she felt, because she was fighting to be seen all along. She had achieved her goals, but illness and a lack of support from the Forest Service forced her into an early retirement. I met her not long after that. So she wanted to return to Portland because she had discovered that she had cancer and would have been close to her family for care, but she was unable to get a transfer. And that was something that she really had to grapple with, because she loved the Forest Service. So anyway, I met her not long after she left the Los Padres in 2011, had that first interview with her in 2013. This is an image of the two of us at the Oregon Historical Society on March 8th of 2020. So right before the world shut down. As Gloria had noted, becoming a forest supervisor would be a test of her survival as a leader and of the Siuslaw National Forest and its employees. And it was also a test for women of color, right? The people were judging them. And it was a test that she passed with high marks. And I know that because a lot of people have told me that since the book came out. So I knew that Gloria had an important story, but I didn't know that telling it would pull together so many threads, from the African-American migration story out of the South after World War II, which is her parents' story, to civil rights history, to an important tale of a Black woman and a single parent, a woman whose determination and resilience was couched within the broader environmental, social, and institutional history of an agency and a region and a nation. And there was something that was really palpable, at least in my mind, and I know that Gloria agrees, that resonated between us, that allowed the two of us to work in a way that translated her essence onto the page. Sometimes it came through transcribed interviews, at others through text that was drafted individually. And then, as I said earlier, poured over by the two of us word by word. Gloria worked on a deadline. When she said she was going to have a chapter done, she got it done. And we worked on that chapter together. And as we worked, I was juggling multiple projects and ran for office. Gloria was engaged in all kinds of volunteer activities and activism. And then her daughter had some health challenges that took her away for nearly a year. So we really struggled to find writing time together, but we did it in bits and pieces. And right about the time that the book was copy edited, Gloria became ill again. But by the time it came out of press, she rallied and she went on to share her her story all over the country, primarily on Zoom. So this is the only time that we appeared together in person. It took us 4 years, and we launched at the Oregon Historical Society. And I'll never forget going out to dinner with her family after our talk. I'm always going to treasure that day. It was the only time that we were together. So she was feeling good and looking good in true vivacious Gloria style. She wore red and she looked great in red. She'd often wear a red hat. That's how I always picture her. And by this time, we had traveled together and spent weekends together and interviewed other people, spent hours in person and again on FaceTime. And even as she went in and out of remission, she was always downplaying her illness and focused on getting this story out there. So I couldn't help but include this picture. This is a picture of Gloria with my granddaughter about 4 years ago. They really hit it off. They would talk to each other sometimes on FaceTime, but they didn't meet each other in person a lot. But you can see how this was. And some of this had to do with Gloria's personality and with my granddaughter's personality. You can see both of them had a very similar personality, lots of wit, smarts. This is what carried her through. And Gloria died on my granddaughter Miley's birthday, September 7th of 2021. So I wanted to share that the first time Gloria told somebody she was going to become a forest supervisor, they laughed at her. And that laughter fueled her resolve. No one was going to tell Gloria she couldn't be in charge. She showed them that she would and that she could. Now, she didn't like to focus on the hard parts of her story, and there are plenty of hard parts. And I sometimes had to push her to tell some of the challenging stories. Hers was a tough journey, and she made it look easy from the outside, but it wasn't. Her life was a lot harder than we wrote and harder than many of us know. But it was also gratifying. It was the kind of life of meaning that most of us yearn for. So this is a picture of Gloria's family. Gloria raised 3 wonderful children who created a really beautiful family legacy for the woman they called Mother Bear. In fact, that's partly one of the chapter titles is Mother Bear Meets Smokey, and that title came about because Gloria and I were driving down the road heading. I don't remember if we were headed to Eugene. We went on several trips together, and her daughter Katrina called, and they talked, I think, every day. And Katrina said, "Mother Bear, Mother Bear," and so the kids would call her Mother Bear, and that title ended up being in the chapter that takes her to out into the forest for the first time. So I think her children are why her lifetime of overcoming challenges left a desire for Gloria to pass on positive lessons. She inspired people to reach for their dreams, to know and believe in their capabilities. And that was really her purpose in writing the book. She told her story so that her family and her readers would believe in themselves. And she wanted everyone who heard her story to know that if they put their minds to it, they could make their dreams come true in spite of, and sometimes because of, the barriers they faced. At the same time, Gloria spent her life fighting for racial justice. She did it in multiple ways. She did it through trying to diversify the agency itself. She was engaged in activism in Lake Oswego in the latter years of her life. And a family friend of Gloria and Phil's, and this is Phil here, and Phil is the former owner of the Northwest Bookstore. A family friend on the day that she died told me that there was something of the divine in our connection, and I actually included this in something that I wrote about and said at her memorial. And I say this because, in retrospect, I'm not sure how we made this book happen in the midst of the other challenges in our lives. She was dealing with, anyway, you have to read the book if you want to know what some of those challenges were. But she was dealing with cancer. I was dealing with all kinds of family issues and working full time and more, and engaging in, being on the school board and all kinds of activities. But in January of 2020, Gloria called me and asked me to shepherd the book through with the press and to keep telling her story, to do talks like this. And I promised her that I would. And I told her what an honor it was to play a small part in her amazing life journey. So I'm really grateful for the serendipity that brought us together. That serendipity included my hearing her voice for the first time and knowing her story 9 years before a friend of mine went to a party and met her in Portland and contacted me and said, I met this woman who's an African-American female from Washington, D.C. She was a city girl who ended up becoming the first Black woman in charge of a national forest. And I said, I know who she is. Can you put us in touch? So I'm really grateful for that. And what has continued ever since. And her family is, as you can see them pictured here, they're also Westerners, and they're a wonderful group of people. And I wanted to end this talk by saying, Gloria Brown, you have made your mark on the world just as you always knew you would. She knew it from day one. So I'm going to go ahead and end the talk here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I can easily talk more. That's pretty typical for me. So, but with that, I guess Bob will come back and we'll see if there are any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. Such a great story. And we've got some questions coming in. One thing that struck me as I was reading the book, and I think you touched on it, and particularly at the end, is Gloria's ability to communicate. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how she used her ability to basically to create bridges throughout her career. There are a number of examples she talked about where she was put in a situation to have to intervene, and she really drew on her power as a communicator and as a bridge builder to affect a connection that hadn't existed before. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was the first thing I observed when I heard her voice. That when she was talking with my student, whose name was Janice Waldron, when she was talking with Janice, she used her name. She used it, and it was very conscious, and I was really struck by that. And so Gloria is someone who would learn your name immediately and use it, and you would feel a personal connection. She did not let any sort of pushback stop her. So an example is getting the Cattlemen's Association Award. When she went out, here she is out in Baker City. And in Baker City, she was one of very, very few African-American people from the city. And she got to know those folks. She went out and there's one story that she tells about how she wanted to see a cow being birthed. And she'd say, she didn't want to see it in the middle of the night. She wasn't looking forward to that. But she was someone who was very clearly focused on building relationships. And that building of relationships is what I really think was significant for her. And she entered into the agency and rose in the agency during a time when that became a kind of key quality that many of the earlier employees didn't have. I mean, we're talking about primarily white men trained as foresters. These are guys who like to hang out in the woods, not people who want to talk with other people. So Gloria could go into a room. She loved to have a potluck. It's one of her favorite things. So she knew that food brought people together. And so she would go into a room and she would win people over who were resistant to her. And she wouldn't let herself be put off, whether it was from sexism or racism, or just, general crotchetiness. And she faced all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think, was a big part of her being successful.
And she also, I'm thinking about the work she did at Mount St. Helens, the connection she made with the folks that she supervised, that there really was this sense of caring and wanting to connect with them and being concerned about their belonging in this environment as well.
Yeah. There's one story that she told me about that actually ended up in my dissertation, but not in the book, about having a couple of African American young people going out into the woods where they felt really unsafe. And they were the only two young Black men working in a remote district. And Gloria made sure that they had a truck to drive back and forth to work because they were feeling a lot of, they were feeling fear and had experienced some hatred. And so she gave them a secure environment. Now, that wasn't typical for someone who was in charge to do that. So she looked out for her employees. And when I read to you a piece of what I posted on Facebook. I have 2 or 3 pages worth of comments with people saying that Gloria was the best supervisor I ever had. And it was that vitality and relational ability. But she was also, I didn't work for her. This was not something that was paid. We connected, decided to do it, and we did it. But she knew how to identify people who would do a good job, and she motivated them to work. And I'm sure she made sure that they stayed on schedule, because that was one of the things. I was engaged in all of these things and I couldn't stay on the same schedule, but we worked through it. And it was a wonderful experience.
I have a couple of questions that touch on something you just mentioned. And I think this is another aspect of Gloria Brown's career, the idea of people of color in largely white spaces in the outdoors, and that that perception that the outdoors is not a place where people of color are welcome. How did her story help change that?
Well, I hope that particularly young people of color read Gloria's story and see that they do belong outdoors. And that's part of the reason that the selections I read to you are selections that illustrate Gloria's connection with the outdoors, the beauty of the environment, that the Pacific Northwest and its landscape is what drew her. And so there is an idea that has to do in part with an urban-rural divide, but also with stereotypes about African Americans not belonging in the outdoors. But the reality is that African Americans have always worked in forests, in forestry. They just weren't in charge. And that's something that I've talked with the Forest Service about, that a number of other people that I've interviewed talked about being connected to the national forest through hunting and fishing, but not actually being allowed to work in national forests. So that's why those laws and the diversity programs, and I didn't put a slide up about that, but there were a number of training programs were really important in recruiting African Americans into the agency. But when you feel like you don't belong in a place because that's what society tells you, African Americans don't belong in the national forests or in the outdoors, then you're less inclined to pursue that kind of career. And so I think that I've heard from a lot of folks that Gloria's story is inspiring to them. She doesn't just tell you you belong, she shows you that she didn't even know she belonged. Another reason I read the piece about the difference, the contrast between having a barbecue in the city, which is all she had ever experienced, and then going into the majesty of a Pacific Northwest forest and experiencing it like everybody experiences it. It's glorious.
Mhm, mhm. Well, it's interesting that we talk about the stereotype and the perception, which I think we've seen recently, the idea that particularly men of color are not welcome in white-mediated outdoor spaces. You can't go bird watching in Central Park
Yeah.
if you're a person of color, and so the perceptions become internalized. And one of the questions we had was about what are some ways that the Forest Service is changing those perceptions, and was Gloria involved in commenting on any of those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, something that you just said about not being able to go bird watching in Central Park, or these ideas that there are certain spaces where you belong, is really at the core of the notion of representative bureaucracy, right? So if you go into a national park or into a park or into a forest and you encounter a park ranger or a forest ranger who is African American, and you're a young African American person, then that's representation actually making a difference. And that's something that Gloria cared very much about. And there's a part in the book that I didn't read where she talks about representation and the importance for herself of going and meeting when she was a little girl. Remember, she grew up in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so access to not just the outdoors, but certain kinds of jobs was not something that she was familiar with. Most African American women that she knew were domestic. They were working in domestic service. Her mother was an LPN. Her father was in the military. And so they were a middle class family. But that issue of representation was really important to her. And did she comment on it? She spoke with a lot of people, particularly in her last couple of years. She did interviews for the Old Smokies newsletter. And as I said, she asked me to carry on this story as an example, in part. And I see here from Lady Vanessa Reyes, who I know through the Greening Youth Foundation and the Forest Service. She asked if Gloria spoke with me about her thoughts about where the Forest Service is headed in terms of DEIA. So what I know, Gloria and I talked a lot about this, that the Forest Service, when there was a downsizing in the 1990s, there was a loss of employees in the agency as timber production was reduced. Now, the numbers of people and representation actually diminished, and Gloria was disturbed by that, as am I. I actually was able to document in my work the ways in which the programs that had been put in place helped to diversify the agency. But and I know that you've heard this before, Vanessa, but last hired, first fired. And so you don't really start seeing African Americans coming into the agency at larger numbers until the 1980s. Well, by the 1990s, there's downsizing. And so the number of African American folks in the agency has been reduced. I attribute some of that to the lack of residential youth conservation corps programming. They used to be able to go into a city where kids had no idea that they loved the outdoors, like the Hispanic man that I referred to at the very beginning, who became a wildlife biologist, like Leslie Weldon, who became a wildlife biologist and went and participated in a YCC program. It engaged her in a natural resource career. So there are organizations working to do that right now that I'm aware of. And you know that, of course, Vanessa. So yes, Gloria was not happy with where things stood or where things stand right now. And I see the good work that you're doing, and I really support it because it's important to create a sense of belonging.
And that lack of representation, I just found the section you were talking about where she said representation counts because of the message employees send to the public, and this is at Mount St. Helens, about belonging. And I think that piece about belonging is so powerful. I loved watching children's faces light up when they interacted with people who looked like them or spoke to them in their native language. And
Right.
then she said, I knew this feeling intimately because I remember meeting a Black teacher when I was in grade school and realizing I could grow up and teach or get some other professional job.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
gave me hope for a future beyond domestic work, since that's what a lot of Black women did, especially in the South.
Hmm.
And Gloria's family was from the South. So she would go back and visit Georgia, and she didn't like it there. It was much freer in Washington, D.C. So she did not like visiting the South when she was a little girl, but she went down there and worked with her cousins and did things like picking cotton in the summertime.
Hmm. I
So,
think the other thing that comes out is the lack of presence doesn't necessarily mean a lack of care about the outdoors. And one of the things that comes through at the very end when she talks about how during her tenure she really left the ecosystem better than when she found it. And I think that sense of caring about something that you may not necessarily feel or have been told that you belong in is a really important message that comes through here too.
yeah, yeah. Well, and um, that was something that she learned. She didn't come into the agency caring about the ecology so
Hmm.
much until she connected with the forest itself and saw the work that was happening. And also, began as she entered into leadership positions and learned about first dendrology. As I said, she did not like it, memorizing the trees. And if Karen Tressler is out there watching, she's someone who helped her to learn her and helped her to get through that. But she loved that shaping of an ecological and sustainable future that came with land management, and that she learned from the biologists she was working with and the people who were engaged in hydrology. And that's what they do. A lot of what they do in the Forest Service, starting in the 1970s, you have teams. It's a very different kind of work than working out in the woods to get the timber out. You have these people working together in teams to actually manage the landscape in sustainable ways. And so she did love that part, and she loved to walk. She's someone who loved to go on walks. We would go down to the beach and go walking on the beach. And that's how we got to know each other. That's where we wrote the proposal for the book was on a beach trip. We spent the weekend
Nice.
working on that.
Mm.
So, I actually see a question here that I'd like to address from
The one
Alyssa.
from Alyssa? Yes, please
Yeah,
do.
how I examine my own identity positionality as it relates to my research on racial diversity and particularly Black women. So that's a great question, Alyssa. I've been doing work on issues that have to do with the history of the Pacific Northwest. And I've been an oral historian. This is how Bob and I met. I used to manage the oral history program at the Oregon Historical Society. So I see my job, and this is what happened in the book. I see my job as a facilitator of storytelling. And as a historian, I document. So in my own work, in my dissertation, I document the historical archival material that actually puts those stories into context. So I have had tremendous growth myself since I first started listening to other people's stories. So my first project was listening to probably 100 women's stories through a project that was done out of Washington State University in the mid 1990s. So that's when I was much, much younger. That was a long time ago, but it was a great introduction to understanding people. And so, in terms of positionality, I know who I am in the conversation. I'm the facilitator of telling someone else's story. So that's how I think about how I do that, particularly when I'm working with people of color or when I'm working with, I've done a lot of work with tribal people. I'm not a tribal person, but I am an academic and a researcher and a historian who can help to facilitate that storytelling, because I have a certain skill set that I can bring to bear in that. And so that's how I deal with that. And, that was something that was not only minimally being talked about in the 1990s, but I've been doing this for a long time. And so I just had a young African-American woman reach out to me and ask if she could work with me on some of the things that I've worked on. So we haven't actually had a conversation yet, but I don't see myself as an authority on other people's experience, facilitator of sharing other people's stories. And that's how I deal with that.
Well, Donna, I think that's a great note to go out on. The book is Black Woman in Green, Gloria Brown and the Unmarked Trail to Forest Service Leadership. Our guest tonight was Dr. Donna Sinclair. Donna, thank you so much for joining us and sharing Gloria Brown's story with our viewers. And remember, folks, you can watch anytime on our YouTube channel. This will go up right after we sign off. So if you'd like to watch again or let your friends and family know about it, please do. Donna, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And
thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to share Gloria's story. This is the first talk that I've done since she passed, and I'm glad I didn't cry, and I miss her dearly, and I hope other people will get to know her by reading the book. I think her voice comes through loud and clear.
Well, thank you so much, Donna, and thank you, everyone. We'll see you
everybody.
all later. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.